Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today we're joined by Carlos Tanner, who has been working with ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest for over 2 decades and is the founder of the Ayahuasca Foundation. After a near-death experience in 2003, Carlos traveled to Peru to seek healing. He then spent 4 years apprenticing under Master Shaman Don Juan Tangoa Paima, and he went on to found the Ayahuasca Foundation, which has become a leading center for both traditional healing and groundbreaking research on ayahuasca's therapeutic potential. Carlos directs the Ayahuasca Foundation out of Iquitos, Peru, where he organizes healing retreats and educational courses led by indigenous curanderos. His work with Onaya Science has produced important research on ayahuasca's effects on depression, anxiety, trauma, and even epigenetics. So in our conversation together, Carlos and I discuss his transformative journey from addiction to becoming a shamanic apprentice, the unique multicultural lineage of his teacher Don Juan Tangoa Paima, how the foundation integrates Western education with ancestral traditions, recent research showing remarkable healing outcomes with veterans for PTSD specific to ayahuasca, the critical role of spirit relationships in healing work, and the evolution of ayahuasca in the modern world. All right, that's it for now. Let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Carlos Tanner. Carlos, it's great to see you once again. We connected many years ago, and I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's great to be here.
So, where are you living at the moment? We're doing this over video. I see this sort of Amazonian background, and I have this maybe slight fantasy that you're deep in the jungle in Iquitos using Starlink to beam in from the deep jungle. Is that true? Is that not true? Kind of where are you at the moment?
There are parts of that are true. We did just get Starlink at one of our centers, so it would be possible. But no, I'm in Massachusetts right now. In 2019, my daughter was 5 years old, and my wife and I decided to move back to the U.S. so that she could start school here. Which turned out to be brilliant. I wish I could take credit for the foreseeing the pandemic, but no, it was just kind of a coincidence. But I just got back from Peru. I was there less than a week ago. So I go back and forth now to make sure that programs kick off correctly, that we do the right maintenance and everything. But my home base is now in Massachusetts. I'm actually in my dad's house right now, but this is just a tapestry on my wall.
Very cool. So I saw you went to University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So it sounds like you're from that area originally. And Amherst is a fantastic liberal arts school. And I always like to ask folks who go to liberal arts schools, how did you end up at a liberal arts school? And just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how was it that in 2003 you ended up in the Amazon and starting the Ayahuasca Foundation in 2009?
Oh man, that's a really long story. I will try to tell it as quickly as possible. But I went to school in Worcester, Massachusetts, not known for having some excellent school system. I was kind of an underachiever. I'd like to chalk that up to, being too bored by the educational system. But for whatever reason, UMass was the only school I applied to, and I really felt like it was the only school that was going to allow me to get in. At that time, back in 1992, anyone that lived in Massachusetts was pretty much accepted to that school. So I was struggling, I guess you could say, with depression due to childhood trauma. If you had asked me, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that at the time. But so I wasn't really in a go-getter type of mood. But my senior year of high school, I did start experimenting with LSD and mushrooms, and I started to really take to them. I think probably because they were providing a pathway perhaps to alleviate my suffering from that deep depression. And so I continued to do that during my studies at UMass. I studied art and philosophy, so I was, really thinking about my career. And I found the works of Terence McKenna and, read Way of the Shaman, and I'd already been reading Carlos Castaneda and Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So I was on a track that had, I became a psychedelic enthusiast, you could say. And And then I graduated. I got a career job, and I thought that I was like gonna be happy because I was successful. But it actually kind of was the opposite, where I started getting worse, and that led me to. I guess I felt like I had gotten successful. Like, how come this isn't making me feel good, and it's making me feel worse? So I accepted that was just the reality, and I started doing harder drugs. So I started taking painkillers and opiates and heroin, and that led to a pretty full-blown addiction, which resulted in me waking up in my car underwater, having blacked out behind the wheel and driven off into a river. And that was my rock bottom moment, where I realized I didn't want to die, and that I was going to do something drastic to save my life. And that, for me, ended up being going to the Amazon rainforest in 2003 to drink ayahuasca with a shaman named Don Juan, in the hopes of saving my life, which it did. And way more than I could have ever possibly imagined. While I was working with him, I think in the third ceremony, he told me it was my path to be a healer, and he invited me to become his apprentice. So in January 2004, I moved to Iquitos, Peru, and I moved in with him and his family, and I lived with him for 4 years. And At the end of that, I came up with the idea for the Ayahuasca Foundation.
Woo! So you end up underwater in a car, literally hitting rock bottom. And you remember back to those books you had read of Terence McKenna's, how he talked about ayahuasca. My first question is, how did the experience of actually going down to the jungle and working with ayahuasca juxtapose to what you had maybe read or learned about it before you actually were in the jungle, whether that was through Terence McKenna or any other books that you had started to explore at that point in time?
Yeah, well, I mean, the word research gets thrown around a lot, and probably usually inappropriately, but I did feel like I was like doing research in my college years. So I was studying, and I was taking notes, and I had like a whole file cabinet full of printouts of all the information I could find. And ayahuasca was definitely at the top of my list as the most intriguing of all the psychedelic substances. I had studied philosophy, so I'd studied actually in class, like shamanism and the philosophy of indigenous paradigms. And so I really do feel like I was like a student of, I guess, non-ordinary states. But ayahuasca definitely piqued my interest above all, because you communicated with spirits. That was like, not many other or any other of the psychedelics I had read about described it that way. And so when I went into my first ceremony, I thought I'm going to meet some spirits and communicate with them. My first ceremony wasn't actually with Don Juan. I stopped in Pucallpa along the way. I actually took a boat from Pucallpa to Iquitos and took a bus to Pucallpa from Lima. And in Pucallpa, there was a school called Ushuaia, which was founded by Pablo Amaringo, the famous visionary painter. Yeah. And so I visited that. And while I was looking at the paintings, the curator, or the person at the school or the museum, asked me if I wanted to drink ayahuasca. So that night I went and drank ayahuasca with this guy who I don't even know if I ever knew his name. And that was my first ayahuasca ceremony. And I had one tiny little vision, which was really kind of like a dream. But I was super excited about it. I was like, yes, I had a vision, So I did have some type of expectation that there was going to be visions and that there would be spirits. But the first real ceremony was with Don Juan when I got to Iquitos, at least as I see it, as being a real ceremony. And that was bonkers. I mean, I saw like 9,000 spirits. I was so overwhelmed. It was it was really a terrible night, if you had asked me at the time. But I was so fascinated by it. Even though I was terrified, I was still fascinated by just how real it all was. And so I went back again, but I vowed not to be afraid the second time, and that made a massive difference. And so I quickly realized like that fear was going to create a big obstacle for me, and somehow was able to like get through that very quickly so that I could really explore what ayahuasca provides in that environment. And then my fascination just went through the roof. The second ceremony, I had the spirit come and put his hand on my shoulder and stand next to me. And that was like a whole nother dimension of seeing a spirit. That was not a dream. I knew exactly where I was. My eyes were open looking at this spirit touching me. And my friend who was in ceremony with me called out to me and said, "Carlos, I'm looking over at you and it looks like there's a spirit standing next to you." And I was like, "Yeah, I know. I'm looking at him." And that really solidified the reality of spirits. And that was instrumental, I think, in me kind of committing to a path that I just couldn't get enough of it. You know, I just wanted to know more and more about it. And I think that the curandero recognized that, and which is why he like invited me to become a student of his.
What was your relationship to spirit prior to that? I mean, you had done the research, you had read the books, you had started to experiment with psychedelics your senior year of high school. Were you raised in a religious family, or were you raised in a more atheist family? I'm just curious, kind of, what was your sort of priming prior to stepping into that ayahuasca space for spirits and entities and things like that?
I guess I could have called myself a spiritual person, but not a religious person. I did grow up in a Methodist family, but my father, when I was very young, decided that he didn't want to go to church anymore. And I was like, I'm with him, you know, so I didn't go to church. I had 3 older brothers. They did go to church, and that was really kind of my mother, I don't know, by the 4th kid, just deciding whatever they wanted. So I got the freedom to not go to church. And that really led me to be a materialist, kind of like I was an atheist for a while. When I started going to college, I think I was an atheist, except that I had started working with psychedelics. So that was kind of cracking my head open to possibilities again. But my concept of spirit was really more like what I would now call life force. Like I felt like it was like an energy. I didn't think of it like a being. But that second night, when that spirit came, I definitely changed my view, and it was now a being. Like it had a shape and a form and a consciousness and a personality, and I talked to that spirit. Like it was a spirit of a person that had died who I knew when I was younger, and there he was, you know. So like, well, what happens after you die? Like there was like a million, you know, things that kind of shattered in terms of what I thought I knew. And I loved that. I just loved that. You know, it was like turning the light on in a room that had been dark my whole life, you know?
Right. So who is Don Juan? Tell us a little bit about the curandero who brought you under his wing for 4 years.
Yeah, Don Juan Tangoa Paima is his full name. And he's passed away, unfortunately, but he was one of the most unique people I've ever met. I think anyone might have ever met, because he was the descendant of 4 very distinct cultures. So his grandfather was Chinese, his grandmother was from India, and another grandmother was from Italy, and then his other grandfather was Peruvian. And so his 2 grandparents were both plant doctors, but from other sides of the world. And he called his tradition the Black Panther Green Dragon, as a nod, the Black Panther to his grandfather from the Amazon, and the Green Dragon, his grandfather from China. And so he was a bizarre collection of cultures. And then when he was 19 years old, the Vietnam War was happening, and the U.S. asked Peru to kind of volunteer or offer some of their soldiers that might be better equipped to fight in the jungles. And he volunteered because he was going to get $10,000. And he actually fought on the U.S. side in the Vietnam War. He went to Vietnam and fought in that war. He got a Purple Heart. He was almost captured, at least that's the story he tells, but because he could speak Chinese, and didn't look American at all, he just like confused the Viet Cong, like they didn't know what, so they just let him go. And so he just had such a unique life. So when he came out of the Vietnam War, he was injured, recovered in the US, teamed up with an oil company that approached him because they wanted to prospect oil in the Amazon, became a guide for the oil companies, taking them into the jungle so that they could try to drill for oil, and then felt the call to come back to his ancestral heritage. And so eventually like left that and started studying with indigenous healers again. And he didn't have an indigenous culture per se because he was such a mix, but he ended up working with the Achuari tribe in northern Peru near the Ecuadorian border, and essentially like became one of their curanderos for several years. And my first ceremony, I was in ceremony with the chief of the Achuari tribe, and he was in the ceremony, and I had no idea that that wasn't normal. So he was actually instrumental for me in like alleviating my fear, because I witnessed that he was not afraid at all. He seemed totally fine. And I was able to observe, even just for a few brief moments, that's how you should act. So that really influenced how I went and approached the next ceremony and every ceremony since then.
And so Don Juan becomes this kind of mythical, shamanic, even like father figure, I would imagine, right? You're down there, you're studying with him for 4 straight years. You're in the jungle, you're doing medicine work. And then at the end of that, you decide to start this foundation, the Ayahuasca Foundation. What were maybe some of the lessons or insights or even the seeds that were sowed during your time with Don Juan that provided the inspiration or the devotion to start something like the Ayahuasca Foundation? Why do that in 2009 when, if this had happened in 2019, it'd be a little bit more, let's say, of the zeitgeist. But 2009, this was still a fairly lesser known medicine, and not really well known outside of very particular circles in the United States.
Well, I will take that as a compliment. I was a student of his, and in a traditional apprenticeship, especially in an Amazonian culture where the indigenous tribes did not have a written language, it was all word of mouth, essentially. It was like an apprenticeship where I followed my teacher around and watched what he did and helped when I could. And, along the way, he might show me something here or there, but it was certainly not like an educational experience that an American would be used to. But I was an American, so I took notes and I used technology. I recorded ceremonies with a mini disc recorder. That's what the technology was 20 years ago. And I had a video camera. And so I wrote down everything I could to help me to learn. I recorded the songs he sang, then transcribed them by listening to the recordings, then translated them. And then I'd show him the translation or the transcription, and he would like make corrections. But I really took advantage of, growing up in an educational structure or a structured educational system. And so at the end of 3.5 years, I was compiling all of my notes and like organizing them. And really, I was just doing that for myself. But I stood back afterward and I was like, oh, wow, like, look at this. I've got this whole section on the songs and the lyrics and the translations and the musical notations. And I've got a whole section on making medicines and all the techniques and strategies and what the medicinal plants are good for. And I had like, a whole curriculum of my own education. And I imagined, what if someone gave this to me when I arrived? Like, what if when the day I arrived, they're like, here, you're going to want this. And they handed me this collection of all this information. Like, how fast I would have been able to learn all of this instead of the process that I had gone through, which was really slow and sometimes frustrating. And that was the light bulb. Like, well, what if I did that? Like, I have this now. I could like offer it to someone else like me that feels called to do this and wants to come and study this. I could like create a course. So that was really what gave birth to the Ayahuasca Foundation, was the idea of finding a way to incorporate a structured educational system into learning an ancestral tradition. And that gave birth to what we still offer, which is the initiation course, which we've offered now 58 times.
Wow. Okay, so I want to dive into this a little bit, and bear with me here as I sort of make my way through my own intellectual cobwebs. So in the West, right, our educational system is more traditional in terms of intellectual literacy, complexity, mathematics, science, right? We are often taught through writing, through analyzing. And I think kind of what I'm feeling into is how much different the 4 years you spent in Iquitos with Don Juan would have been from a 4-year undergraduate or graduate program, right? And what's coming up for me is even as some of that frustration that you had to navigate and to learn was part of your training in and of itself. And so I'm curious to hear your perspective on what is this balance between courses or a more Western way to approach, let's say, the onboarding process into the ayahuasca cosmology versus the experiential element of sitting and being in dozens of ceremonies, right? There are, I would imagine, certain things that can be taught in a dialectic form, but with ayahuasca in particular, there's a lot of things that have to be experienced and observed and lived through in order for it to be integrated into someone's psyche and cosmology.
Totally. Well, I think the key word that has helped me to describe that is art form. So I look at the healing arts as an art form. And I think once we put it into that context, a lot of things fall into line that make more sense for us. And then I can tell a little story about my own like experience with an art form. I played a hand drum, like an African percussive instrument called an ashiku from Africa, like a ancestral drum. But I never took a lesson with it. I bought the drum. I thought it was cool. I just started banging on it. And I banged on it for years and years. And I got up to a point where I was playing professionally, actually. Like I had a gig every weekend or every other weekend. And a lot of people thought I was good at it. But I felt like I was hitting a plateau. And so after years, I decided that I would take some lessons. And I went to someone that was in the Cuban National Orchestra who happened to make drums and live nearby, and he gave lessons. And I remember that first lesson, he was like, well, you don't know how to play the drum. And I was like, what? I was really offended. I was like, hey, man, I get paid to do this, But this guy obviously knew what he was talking about. And I really, my ego like struggled a lot with having to accept the fact that even though I'd played for years, I had a lot of experience, I didn't actually know proper technique. And then I had to unlearn my bad technique, and so that he could teach me proper technique. And it didn't take long for him to teach me proper technique. Once I had proper technique, I could go past that plateau. I could go much farther. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I hope that like makes sense of what I'm saying. Like, yeah, experience is a lot. And especially in an art form, experience can be everything. You don't even have to take a lesson to be a great artist. But that is an exception, I would say. The higher likelihood is that if you do get a chance to study with someone that knows proper technique and theory, and especially like in the sense of music, like, yeah, you can buy a guitar and you can like try to figure it out, and you can get to a place where you play some music. But if you were to study even just for a couple months with someone that really knew how to play and could teach you the proper philosophy of music theory and the proper technique, then it would still take you a long time to practice, but you would be less likely to hit plateaus that were the result of a lack of understanding. And so that's kind of like what the goal is for the course, is to provide a good principle foundation of understanding technique and theory, so that you have fewer and fewer obstacles as you continue to practice. So it definitely takes the experience. But I wish in my studies, like there would be times where it'd take me 6 months to realize I didn't know what I was doing. And, if someone had just been there to say like, hey, actually you want to do it this way, then I wouldn't have wasted some of that time.
Right. So the the technical principles, and this is true for any skill, right? It could be true for a martial art, for an instrument, even for cooking, right? Having that awareness and that knowledge is then a foundation that can be then built on. Because once the technical linear things are handled and taken care of, you can actually pour yourself even deeper into the artwork of what it is that you're facilitating, which often requires more time, energy, nuance, experience, sort of an experiential element behind it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like art form, because you can't train yourself to be a great artist. There's a quality that can't be taught. You can teach someone technique, you can teach them theory, you can teach them all these things that might help to cultivate a gift that they have. But it's ultimately that gift that really determines the quality of the artwork, or, the beauty of the artwork. And that's what I think of when I think of shamans or curanderos. There's a gift there. There's a special quality. And then, yes, they are able to cultivate that through their teachings or through the lessons that they're learning. But you can't train someone to be a great musician or a great artist. That's a special quality that's outside of the realm of academics.
So you come out of your 4-year apprenticeship with Don Juan. It's 2009. You start the Ayahuasca Foundation. The impetus for starting the Ayahuasca Foundation is to provide some of the technical knowledge that you had to navigate yourself for those 4 years deep in the jungle. We're now 15 years onwards from that. It's 2024. You're still running the foundation. Tell us a little bit about the trajectory of growth and development that the foundation has gone through, especially in the last 5 years, as ayahuasca has become much more prominent in the West, and all of these retreat centers are opening, and all of these Westerners are flying down to Costa Rica and Peru and Brazil and Colombia. How has the foundation itself grown and evolved through this time?
Well, one thing that's been remarkable is just seeing the type of people that arrive. 20 years ago, like you mentioned, or even just 15 years ago, ayahuasca wasn't really well known, to say the least. And so most of the people that showed up didn't know very much about it. But people are showing up now that have done weekend retreats and have done plant dietas and, have really like read and researched way more than you could, it would have been impossible 15 years ago. And that's been remarkable to see, just like the caliber of participants showing up. And so because of that, I think we're able to go much deeper. But also, our organization might be unique in this sense, but we've worked with just one family for the last 16 years. So we have been able to continue to develop and perfect and go further and further with the programs that we offer, because we constantly have been working with the singular familial lineage of one family. And I think that's been able to enable us to go very, very deep in what we offer. But psychedelic assisted therapy has happened in the last 5 years, which would have been like a fantasy if you had asked me about it 15 years ago. And that's having a big impact. I became certified in psychedelic assisted therapy this year. And so I really feel like what I'm moving the Ayahuasca Foundation towards is a collaboration with psychedelic assisted therapy, such that the development of this new emerging field in modern culture is influenced and informed by ancestral philosophy and tradition. And that to me is become like a new passion for me. So next year we'll be offering a therapist retreat specifically for psychedelic assisted therapists so that they can immerse themselves in the ancestral paradigm in the hopes of incorporating aspects of that paradigm into their understanding of how to better offer that therapy when they return from that program. So I'm really excited about that. And I kind of feel like we're pivoting towards that. I think like more and more of our work will be centered around that concept of influencing how ancestral traditions can be integrated into the new field of psychedelic assisted therapy.
And what do you think are the biggest lessons or insights that Western trained therapists, psychiatrists, medical professionals, what is the opportunity in going to the jungle to work with ayahuasca? Why do you think that is such an important or essential element of their own process of growth and development when working in this space?
Similar to the conversation about the art form, I just did an interview for a film that will premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival. It wasn't interviewing me, though. I was interviewing our curandera, Doña Angela, but for the film, so they filmed her, and I just happened to be the person interviewing her. And in that interview, she did a brilliant job of talking about like what it means to be a curandera. And one of the things she said was, I don't really know how to do very much, but I know how to bring the spirits into the ceremony. And when they're there, they direct me as to all the things that I do. And that concept, which is at the heart of shamanism, that's really what a curandero is a person that can, as they call it, open the world of ayahuasca so that the spirits can come to them. And then those spirits tell them what to do. They guide them. They essentially like work through the curandero. And that's very different than the current model of psychedelic assisted therapy, which takes kind of an academic approach, and there's protocols, and it's like, if this happens, then you do this, and you're kind of studying it and you're memorizing it and you're trying to remember all this information about what to do in each situation. In the shamanic culture, it's not like that. You need to know how to build the relationships with the spirits, and they'll take care of the rest. And so you cultivate those relationships with spirits, you begin to develop familiarity and build friendships, and then when you're in whatever situation you're in, they are there to help you. So I think that would be fantastic to incorporate that so that a psychedelic assisted therapist has built a relationship with a spirit, at least maybe more than one, and then should they get themselves into a situation, they don't have to worry, oh my God, what do I do now? What's the protocol? Let me remember my notes. Like, let's try to get back to the teachings. No, they're just guided because of that relationship that they built. So that's at the core of the program that we offer, is a relationship building exercise called the Plant Dieta, so that they can begin to develop a relationship with a spirit that can guide them. And that's really at the heart of it. And underneath that, or surrounding that, or growing from that, are a lot of principles that may be more distinct for the ancestral paradigm, which would be like the interconnectivity of all things, as an example, where our Western paradigm kind of posits us as like individuals separate from one another. The ancestral paradigm is quite the opposite. It's like, no, you cannot separate us from one another. And that then, I think, addresses what has become an epidemic of loneliness in modern culture. And I think that it's difficult to address the epidemic of loneliness with something done in like a psychotherapy setting, but something done in a group ceremony setting that combines working with beings from another dimension, essentially, really is able to tackle that in a way where a person could leave a session knowing that they're never alone. And just that could make a really big difference in someone's life.
Yeah, there's this sort of, not a phrase, but some media have talked about how like therapists or psychiatrists are the sort of shamans of, Western healthcare. And I do think it misses a critical aspect, which is, in our paradigm, we're so focused on only the physical body, or with mental health, you could say serotonin, or even, trauma, which is for sure legit. It's another aspect and element that's important, but we have very little enlivened spiritual literacy, that even those of us who have been raised in more religious environments, and I would count myself in that, we have sort of this intellectual abstraction of God that is brought in through certain songs and rituals, but it's very rare to have this divine connection that is opened up. And I will be curious to see how that potentially plays out with, therapists who are doing medicine work. And even as I'm talking about this, it's like the FDA, so we know, the FDA rejected MDMA, but there may be LSD, psilocybin that could still get approved, as well as MDMA down the road. But it almost feels like even that paradigm is not conducive to this type of work, that the models that, I love Colorado and what they've set up, that the capacity to do group work, the capacity to work not just with ketamine or not just with these synthetics, but actually the whole plant intelligence and the plant ally, because part of working with ayahuasca is the cosmology or the intelligence of those two particular plants that are grown in a particular region, in a particular area. Whereas with psilocybin or San Pedro, the cosmology or the intelligence may be slightly different. There's parallels, but there's differences. So just the introduction of this concept in this way, I would hope opens up new neural pathways for some of these facilitators to recognize that the only truth that is valid in this work is not necessarily that which has been taught in the West, but that there's this sort of compendium of knowledge and intelligence elsewhere that is, if not just as useful, even more useful when working with a lot of these ancient plant medicines.
Without a doubt. Yeah, if I were to simplify the paradigms of the modern age and our ancestral paradigms, which could be called indigenous, but really they're all of our ancestry, depending on how far you go back. I could call the modern paradigm a material paradigm, and the ancestral paradigm a non-material. And so the ancestral paradigm basically says what happens in the non-material realms, it dictates everything in our lives. And that's kind of the opposite view of the material paradigm, which kind of tries to ignore the non-material. It doesn't really know what to do with the non-material. Now we have new branches of science that are definitely tackling that and kind of like bringing things full circle or coming back to the origin, but they're not like mainstream at all. Quantum physics is not exactly like what a general regular person understands. But if you were to delve into it, you would see that actually they're pretty much discovering that exact same phenomenon. And the weirdest example to me is the placebo effect. Everyone recognizes it. It's no one is like questioning whether the placebo effect is real. It's definitely real. But yet it doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, and because I just don't think it's understood. It's kind of like, well, yeah, that just happened. Someone was healed. They didn't take any drug or anything. They had a sugar pill, but it worked because they believed it. Like, what? Like, that can happen? Like, you can just believe something and be healed, like, for real? And I wish that we gave a more respect to that and more curiosity, because I think that's pretty much the answer. If we were to look at the power of consciousness more, we would probably take leaps and bounds. And I'm hoping that this new interest in psychedelics, or this revival of interest in psychedelics, is going to do just that. It's going to bring our attention to the power of consciousness once again.
Well, and this is a slight tangent, but yesterday I was reading about Krishnamurti, who was a really well-known mystic from India. He was sort of anointed as the chosen one for the Theosophical Society. He rejected it, moved to Ojai, and taught. And I was just reading through his Wikipedia profile, and it said in there that he ended up forming a pretty close relationship with David Bohm, who was like the father of quantum physics. And it almost feels like, although we've been talking about quantum physics for I mean, over 100 years now since Einstein's theory of relativity came on in 1906. The modern paradigm is still fairly rooted in Newtonian physics and reductionism, and it feels like this deepening of relationship with indigenous wisdom, in particular through plant medicines, is actually creating some spaciousness culturally to openly talk about quantum physics and quantum entanglement and the sort of concept that consciousness is permeating everything. And that is now opening up new pathways collectively for us to explore. All that to say is, I don't know how much longer it might be until it's accepted, but I do feel like those who are doing work with plant medicine, in particular with ayahuasca, it often fundamentally shifts their metaphysical worldview into something that is outside of the reductionist paradigm, which I think is very exciting.
Yeah. I don't even know if Einstein said this, but I remember hearing, and maybe it's even like a joke, but that he was like simplifying down relativity, and he said, sit with a pretty girl on a park bench for 10 minutes and it feels like 1 second. Put your hand on a hot stove for 1 second and it feels like a lifetime. That's relativity. And I think that, I've been working with this tradition for decades now, and that's kind of where I've come to in valuing the most important thing is my state of being. What my thoughts are, what my feelings are, what the sensations are. That's the most important thing in my life. Because if I'm in a high state of being, like if I'm in a state of joy, then I view the world through the lens of that state of being. And the world looks like it's filled with joy because I am viewing it through the lens of my state of being. But I'm not just viewing it. I'm radiating my state of being out into the world. And I radiate that joy out into the world such that the world reacts to my joy. And then it responds according to my joy, or according to my anger, or according to my guilt, or my fear, or my shame. But if I then focus my goal in life to aspire to my highest states of being, that is the surest way that I will find myself in my best place in my life, and I will also be contributing my best energy to the world. So I'll make the world a better place the more I can find myself in a state of joy and peace and love. And so, I think like we're kind of caught in a place where we want to make the world better and we're angry it's not. And the anger is not going to make it better. The moving up into those higher states of being will. And not just because you'll see it differently, but also you will literally radiate that into the world, and the world will respond to it by becoming better. And that to me has become an incredibly valuable lesson to learn. And I do attribute that to, working with ayahuasca. And ayahuasca shows it to you like straight in your face. Right. Because if you've ever been afraid in an ayahuasca ceremony, it's terrifying. But if you've been in a state of joy, it's blissful. And it's not that the ayahuasca is somehow, different one night than the other. It is responding to you, and you are seeing it through the lens of your state of being. And so it's everything.
So we have a few minutes left, and prior to starting the podcast, you had mentioned some research that you had been up to. And I think this is an interesting transition point because we've been talking about more the non-dual paradigm. And yet, as we know, in this third wave of psychedelics, the research that is established about these medicines helps to generate more interest and confidence in how they can support people. And so I'd love just to sort of open it up a little bit. Tell us a little bit about some of the research that you've been doing through the Ayahuasca Foundation, and what are you noticing and observing about the power of ayahuasca to help with healing and transformation?
Yeah, I should mention I'm not doing the research. I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I've been collaborating with a group called Onaya Science for the last 8 years. And so they've been conducting the research. They're doctors from the UK, and it's been just a pleasure to work with them. We've become really good friends. But one of their most groundbreaking studies was the first ever epigenetic study on ayahuasca, which may have been the first ever epigenetic study on any psychedelic. So they were taking DNA samples before and after retreat and then 6 months later. And they were specifically targeting one gene that is called Sigmar-1, which had already been associated with childhood trauma. And so essentially in epigenetics, it's not just your genes, it's about whether your genes become activated or not. And so there's kind of like a sleeve over your genes, but then that sleeve can get pulled back and essentially like activate the gene and have it be an influential part of your being, or the sleeve can cover it and then the gene's influence won't be present. So it's like deactivating it. And if you have experienced a severe trauma, then this gene Sigmar-1 will become activated. So it's like a genetic marker of emotional trauma. And so they were targeting that, looking to see, and people that had an activated Sigmar-1 gene who had experienced trauma, after doing a retreat, they had deactivated the Sigmar-1. So there was actually like a genetic evidence of the healing of trauma, which was groundbreaking. And to this day, I think that study, which was published on Frontiers in Psychiatry, has been viewed like more than 99% of the other studies because it was so unique. But recently, the last 2 years, we've been hosting research and retreats in collaboration with Heroic Hearts Project, which is specifically for military veterans suffering from PTSD, and then doing research to look at the full genome, so a full genetic analysis, but also the psychological evaluations and blood samples, stool samples, like a really like comprehensive research project. And over the last 2 years, we've had 46 veterans, all with PTSD, participate in that study. And after doing a 10-day retreat with us, 0 of them had PTSD. So out of 46, all 46 no longer met the criteria for PTSD. That's a pretty remarkable number. We sent that research to Rick Doblin because of his MDMA research, very similar, and he essentially signed off that it was good science. So that study will most likely be published at the beginning of next year and in 2025, and then we'll see what the response is with that. But that's been really remarkable, and that was what that interview I was doing was for a film that was on the veterans. So that film will like show that and hopefully show it to a really big audience, just how powerful this treatment can be, especially for military veterans with PTSD.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if we've had Maxie Cohen on the podcast, but I have a friendship with her personally, and she helped to produce and direct From Shock to Awe, which was an ayahuasca documentary about PTSD that was published maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I believe. And it feels like there's even more of a groundswell momentum now. I mean, before we went live, I mentioned the study that was done with Ibogaine for Navy SEALs who had TBI, and I think something like 28 or 29 out of 30 were able to basically come out of that experience no longer having clinical symptoms for TBI. Why is it that ayahuasca is so helpful for PTSD? What is it doing in particular that is so powerful for these vets that come back from war?
Well, that's, I wish I could say that I knew for sure, but I can share my thoughts on it. Maxie Cohen, by the way, interviewed me for a film called Ayahuasca Diaries, and hopefully that film will also be at the Tribeca Film Festival in June. So she's still at it, like editing that film. But my feeling about what happens in trauma is that it usually happens in a hypersensitive space, like a state of being of hypersensitivity, which typically is created by fear. So when you feel like your survival is being threatened, I think that we have a natural response to expand our sensory perceptive ability. So to like expand the brain's ability to process more information than we're normally accessing. So the visible spectrum is an easy example of that. Our eyes actually see a lot more light frequency than that. But along the way, when it's passing through the amygdala into the brain center where we process it, it gets reduced. It's a process called sensory gating. And so sensory gating essentially creates this little window of everything that we know to be real. But our perceptive ability goes beyond that. And I think that when we're in a state where our survival is being threatened, our brain just naturally says, okay, here's more information. Like, you might need this. This might help you to survive right now. It would be overwhelming if you were like that all the time, but right now I'm going to give you more access. And in that moment, in that time period, we form a belief that is false. And that belief might be that we're always in this state of being threatened, or that there's a threat, around any corner. And essentially we decide or take on a false belief as a truth of our reality. And then we kind of come back to our normal shape, but that truth exists, like part of it exists out in this realm that we can't access anymore. So even if we are aware of it, even if we're like, I know that I'm doing that, but I can't stop doing it, because we can't actually access that. And because it was happening in this amplified perceptive state. And so ayahuasca mimics that hypersensitivity, or the amplification of sensory perception. It reduces sensory gating, or allows the expansion of sensory information to be processed, but it does it in a completely safe way. You're not doing it because of you've induced it because of a threat to your survival. You've induced it in this ceremonial way built on trust and faith. And so in that space, you can then correct the misinterpretation or the false belief and make it an accurate truth again, and then come back, and now you've resolved that. You're not operating based on a falsehood anymore. You're operating more on the truth. And that's how I would describe like the resolution of childhood trauma or PTSD.
Yeah, in a 3-minute response. I mean, that we could do a whole podcast about specifically, what's happening with ayahuasca and PTSD. Another thing that comes up is the power of choice, right? That oftentimes when these traumatic experiences happen, we are thrown into them, or they happen to us, or we are forced in a situation that could be in war, that could be sexual assault, that could be as a young child. And so ayahuasca is, like you said, it opens up that sensory gaining, but now we kind of have this impression that we're making that choice. We have that autonomy. We're willing to go into this. And that also, I think, helps to repattern that relationship to this hypersensory experience, which allows people to feel safe in a very activated state. Whereas before, the activated state represented the war or the trauma or the assault or whatever it was.
There's so many layers to it. I mean, there's the layer of like how we respond to the trauma. So, we have a trauma response, but then we bring our awareness to the trauma response, and almost always we have a negative emotion connected to recognizing the trauma response. We get angry at ourselves, or we feel ashamed, or, and so we pile on another response. And something that happens in an ayahuasca ceremony also is this, kind of divine realization, or this experience of divinity, and where we recognize ourselves for the innocence of our being, like the truth of our spirit. And so then you forgive. It's so simple to forgive all those feelings. Don't be mad about that. That's just pain that you felt. You don't have to feel bad about that, and you're almost like holding yourself as a child, soothing the cries of the innocent child. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just 50 layers on that, but yeah.
Well, this is great. Thank you, Carlos, for for joining us for the podcast. Folks, go to ayahuascafoundation.org. They have 10 or 18-day ayahuasca retreats, as well as 4 and 8-week Shipibo training courses. Anything else you'd like to add, just in terms of maybe other resources or places that you'd like to send people before we wrap up today?
I mean, all of it is accessible through the website, but we do have a YouTube channel, which you can find by searching Ayahuasca Foundation. I did a 10-episode series called Lessons from Ayahuasca, where I talk about all of the things that I learned from my experiences, studying this tradition. So that might be worth checking out too.
Great. So check out their YouTube channel as well. And Carlos, I appreciate, we spent a little bit of time telling your story and unpacking that, hearing about Don Juan, going into, I think, the importance of the cosmology and experience of ayahuasca, especially for those who are coming from the West, and then heard a little bit about the research through Onaya and the research with Heroic Hearts that will be published in early 2025. So I so appreciate the work that you've done over these last 15 years through the foundation. You've been a pillar in the community in terms of the quality and integrity of the work. And it's been an honor to host you on the podcast today. So thank you for joining.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you too.
Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date on the third wave of psychedelics, subscribe to this channel and visit thethirdwave.co, where you'll find plenty of free resources on the intentional and responsible use of psychedelic medicine.